We have Lynn Lichtenfeld, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Jasper Health. Great. Eric Rubin from Merck. Tim Suther from Change Healthcare. Marc Watkins from Kroger. And Nadja Young from SAS. So let's welcome our panelists. So maybe we'll just go down the line here, and it would be good if you could all sort of introduce yourselves and tell us what is the biggest challenge at your organization related to this topic of equity, inclusion, and access.
So my name is Lynn Lichtenfeld. I'm Chief Medical Officer for Jasper Health. Formerly was with the American Cancer Society for a number of years. And I think after the last discussion, I've got to make some disclosures. I do some other things along the way, advise some companies. Happen to be, in light of that conversation, I'm an advisor to Guardant, which is a company involved in early detection, and also advise some, as I mentioned, some other early stage companies on the board of cancer care. Jasper Health, and just to not take too much time given the panel and the size of the panel, Jasper Health is a relatively new company. We're involved in giving support to cancer patients and caregivers through the cancer journey. We're a digital infrastructure company primarily, but we're also hybrid in that we will meet people wherever they may be, whether it be digital, online, whether it be by Zoom or other video or by telephone. And the objective is to help them through that cancer journey. We might be able to talk a little bit more about that. But I would also emphasize, and our partnerships include Memorial Sloan Kettering, we're the digital partner for them, and also some of the Cigna companies, among others that I can't share with you at this time, but will be able to shortly. So we're an evolving organization, and I think everyone who's in this space that we're in will say pretty much the same thing. What you see today is not what you're going to see tomorrow, is not what you're going to see next week. We'll have a chance, I'm sure, during the conversation to share a little bit. When I look at the issues that face oncology, I have to tell you that one of the things I don't do is talk the company line, much like yourself. You know, we've been around cancer, health policy for a long time, physician payment, whatever. And active in medical organizations on a national level. And I will say that access, getting people in the door, more importantly, keeping them in the door and providing them the resources that, and frankly, people at many levels, but particularly those who need that assistance. I think access and making sure people get the care that we can currently provide. If we did what we already know, much like what NCI has done, the Cancer Society, we've written papers to the effect, if we did what we could for everyone, what we do for people with college educations, we would be a lot better off in terms of reaching our goals to reduce the burden of cancer.
Eric?
So Eric Rubin, I'm a medical oncologist. I oversee the early clinical development program for oncology at Merck. As part of this role, and I also oversee translational oncology. As part of this role, I'm responsible for taking new compounds into first-in-human studies as well as additional early phase studies. And of course, as part of that, I work closely with our operations group. We do our clinical trials globally in 50 different countries, and we're very concerned about ensuring diversity, inclusion, and health equity for our clinical trials. We have a group that focuses on this, and they have sort of 4 areas where there are ongoing initiatives. One relates to infrastructure at Merck itself. The second has to do with clinical trial planning, and these include diversity clinical plans. Some of you may know FDA is also quite active in this space, and we work with FDA on ensuring that we have appropriate diversity plans for our trials. We also have a community outreach effort, including collaborations with some of the organizations here at this meeting. And then last, seeking to improve diversity in the clinical trial research workforce.
And I'm Tim Suther. I'm with Change Healthcare. It's a pretty large health IT company serving most of the providers and payers in this country. Unlike most of you, I've spent most of my career outside of healthcare, about 30 years in data and analytics and technology, largely in financial services and ad tech, two of the most advanced industries in the world. And perhaps, like many of you, I became alarmed 5 years ago at the cost of healthcare and its disassociation with the results, twice per capita any other developed country in the world, and we rank 43rd or 44th in the world in life expectancy. So I came to healthcare 5 years ago with the idea of applying best practices from those industries into healthcare. And to answer your question, that I think healthcare has a data liquidity problem. So we're here to talk about the lack of diversity in clinical trials, yet there are a good portion of people who would otherwise be qualified for trials are showing up at community health centers, but they never find out about trials. So we are committed to developing advanced pre-screening techniques to make sure that people who are qualified for trials, who aren't at sites where there are investigators, at least can be made aware of the trials. And we think that that can make a big difference in participation. And then later on in the life of the drug, the ability to disaggregate therapeutic effectiveness and financial performance. We've done a lot of work to connect claims information to the major social determinants of health, and we've studied lots of therapeutic areas, and it all comes down to economic stability. Can you afford care? Health literacy, do you understand care? And sadly, the color of your skin. So our mission is to address the data liquidity problem by connecting information that is available. It's just not available to decision makers, and our job is to take the friction out of that process.
Marc.
Very well said, Tim. I'm Marc Watkins, Chief Medical Officer of Kroger and Kroger Health, and it's just amazing to be on this panel and hear what the opening comments are. And so you might be saying to yourself, what in the world is the grocery store doing up here on the stage, right? So we're the nation's largest traditional grocer, and it's just been an amazing journey for me to be part of this organization. And let me share with you what we've been working on and why we think it's important. It's mainly from lessons learned during COVID and then even pre-COVID. So we were lucky enough, when you have such a large population, over 500,000 associates, you get the opportunity to ask them lots of questions, right? And so we have, over the last couple of decades, have what we call associate resource groups. So we leverage these associate resource groups, and we call our employees associates. And so these associate resource groups are made up of the African American resource group, the Asian American, the Latin and Hispanic American. We have an LGBTQ. And so we were asking very specific questions about health and nutrition and understood that, again, access becomes an issue. And so we have two large initiatives. One is to change the way America eats, and then to help, and we believe that can be impactful. And the reason why we have something like 69 million Americans that are either overweight or obese. We know that obesity is now replaced smoking as one of the most modifiable risk factors for about 9 different cancer types. And then if we realize if we can't change the way America eats, and then we don't do something about health equity, especially with things like clinical trials. So we've stepped our toe into the clinical trials arena. We have a little bit more than, if you include all of our pharmacies and clinics, we have a little bit more than 2,200 to 2,400 access points around the country for diversified trials. And so we're setting up our diversified trials, in meaning that we'll be able to recruit because our stores reflect our communities. And by reflecting our communities, we believe we have a huge opportunity with our pharmacists, with our data, to begin to have meaningful conversations with patients that otherwise might qualify. And you might say, well, how will you do that? Well, looking at our data and our data lake with at our pharmacy, looking at a comprehensive medication review, pretty quickly you can tell what patients are suffering from, and then engage them in discussions around, would you be interested in learning more about clinical trials, and then connecting them, like Tim said, to the already existing information that's out there.
Nadja.
Thank you so much. My name is Nadja Young. I lead our education practice at SAS, and really am serving as a voice of the connection point between our industry perspective and the work that we do in academia to facilitate research, and then as well the corporate perspective as one of North Carolina's largest employers. And what I find as at SAS, as a company that supports over 3,000 education, higher ed institutions that are conducting a lot of this health research, and then simultaneously supporting the commercial health and pharma industry, as well as on the government side, many of the federal, all of the federal departments that support and fund a lot of this health research, as well as state departments of public health, that there is a continuous need for more integration, more collaboration, more sharing of data in a secure manner, because we have so much good work happening in silos. So many university faculty and researchers operating on their laptop or desktop. So many large initiatives being funded that really could revolutionize and open up breakthroughs in research, but we need to be able to share and scale. And oftentimes, data privacy, data security are real concerns for that. So we're so happy to be able to invest and support things like the Project DataSphere that really help to expand access to large data sets for research, and really wanting to help better connect the stories and the people. And so I think that this type of a convening is a huge step forward, and has been for 20 years, in connecting the people who can then work together and really bring back best ideas, best of breed ideas to their companies, to their institutions, and to their states. I think that every university health system, just like every commercial health system, has issues with health equity, with increasing diversity, inclusion, and it was raised by you, sir, on the left about 40 years ago, FDA saying we needed to improve diversity in clinical trials. So we're seeing the need for education, and the role for education really as being so important to help educate communities and educate younger learners and younger leaders of research and medical breakthroughs of tomorrow. So really doubling down on our investment in HBCUs and minority-serving institutions to provide the types of tools and training in data science to equip them to do this research, doubling down on our own HR efforts for recruitment, for internships, for our academies, for our data science and STEM fields, and trying to be a leader in our community in not only North Carolina, but Dr. Goodnight really being a leader among CEOs around the country for the continuous focus on increasing diversity, access, and inclusion. We also, like Kroger, have what we call affinity groups. You call them resource groups, but very similar. So we're constantly soliciting feedback from our employees to help improve our own programs, but also have created a data ethics practice, and realizing that we need to be identifying in all of our R&D work opportunities where bias can show up in the data life cycle, which could be at many different points of entry. So we have a whole team now dedicated to just looking at bias in AI, so that hopefully can be mitigated before it crops up and becomes a problem.
So several of you mentioned various problems with data, and I find this really interesting. And this, we are here at sort of a high palace of data in the North America. At the very early days of COVID, believe it or not, the National Cancer Institute was given a bunch of money to try and answer what we thought was a relatively simple question: does your antibody status correlate with your risk of future infection? For a variety of reasons, we were the ones asked to do that. And it was a straightforward data problem. And we thought, we'll just get a bunch of data and we'll put it together and we'll know, like tomorrow, easy, right? And it wasn't. It's quite a mess. There's issues of privacy and sharing and aggregation and, bias hidden within the data. It's really hard. But I think everyone agrees that clinical trials of the phase 3 randomized variety are just getting so expensive that if we want to make progress in cancer, we have to use data more wisely and more efficiently. So how can we do that? What are the problems? And I'll throw it out to the whole panel. You all will have strong feelings on this topic. What could we do differently or better around using data for novel purposes?
So if I may start, and then we'll go down the panel.
Yeah.
You and I shared something by being involved in oncology at the beginning of COVID, and I have the pleasure of saying to the country, don't screen now, because we thought that the world was coming out quickly. If you remember the University of Washington data, and bless them for what they did, but they had a containment date of May something or other, and it turned out that wasn't the case. So let's talk about what happened as a result of that, aside from the fact that in different communities there were different issues. But let me tell you what bothered me and share it with this audience on this topic. Aside from the fact that we have a lousy data infrastructure when it comes to understanding cancer in this country, and you know that, and others in this room know that, and they're trying to address it. Here's what I was saying and my theme at that time. When we come out of this, we're going to have a crush of people who should be screened for cancer, people at high risk who need to be screened, the breast cancer patients at high risk, the colorectal cancer patients at high risk. We should identify those individuals and put them to the front of the line no matter who they are. Because some people will always have access to care because they're the loudest voice in the room, and they'll go to their doctors and they'll demand, and the doctors will make phone calls and say, hey, get my patient to the front of the line. But the people who don't have that voice didn't have that opportunity, and I kept saying, we need to identify those folks, and we need to reach out to them, and we need to make sure that we take that responsibility to get them to the front of the line. They didn't get to the front of the line. Data issue. And we didn't have I think we somewhere have the data sets, but it was just a matter of open the door and here they come back in the door. So that's an example of a data issue that we should have been able to address, still can't address, and people who don't have status need to have care, and we should help them get in the door when they need that care. A larger theme, but I'll defer to my other panelists for their comments as well.
So maybe I can just comment from a clinical research perspective. While we too, I think, struggle with data infrastructure. In fact, we're going through a change in our system for our electronic case report forms now, which, as you can imagine, is fairly painful. But one of the things that I think that we found very useful, again, in terms of early oncology clinical development, is access to genetic databases that are diverse. So we were, as you may know, among the first. We formed a collaboration with the Moffitt Cancer Center now probably 15 years ago to access basically every patient that entered the door. Underwent it was RNA at the time. Now it's DNA, and that we actually used that in the early days of Keytruda to identify cancer types that we thought would be not only cancer types, but subgroups of patients in individual cancers. So we designed some of our early trials using that information, and we also participate now in the AACR Genie project, for example, and others. And I think those types of resources, at least from my perspective as a drug developer, have been quite helpful.
Well, I said that healthcare has a data liquidity problem, and it surely does. Many of the hardest problems in healthcare require a collaborative approach to address it. So research, safety, therapeutic journeys, patient journeys, operational performance, all of those require collaboration. So if you want to address a data liquidity problem, you have to address it at the source, which is having programs that are focused on building data collaboratives. And we've been, at Change Healthcare, focused on that for well over 10 years. And, we've built a database of over 42 billion care events going back 10 years, all of it granted by permission from, payers and providers, because they recognize that there are just some things that you can't do yourself. You must do them together, and research is clearly one of those. You mentioned the pandemic. That's why I'm sitting here today. 3 years ago, when we had this infectious disease that no one had ever seen before, it turned out that we were seeing that at scale in the systems that we make available to health systems. And, we wanted to help the country get back on its feet, so we began isolating the COVID experience to any academic center, medical center that wanted it. And we were studying, the crazy therapies that were coming out. We were looking at comorbidities. We saw diagnoses and tests and hospitalization and mortality. And with our colleagues at SAS, we were one of the early founders of the COVID database cooperative. And that journey led us to health equity, which is okay if you've got all this information about what's happening in the doctor's office. Well, what about life outside it? It turns out that while that information is pretty sparse in healthcare systems, it's readily available in the balance of the world. So we're pretty good at data engineering. So we took the time to engineer the major social determinants of health and began to make that available to any academic medical center that wanted to publish the results for the benefit of everyone. And that led us to here. If we can do it for COVID, if we can do it for health equity, we can do it for the hardest disease on the planet. So starts with permissions and making it available to bright minds that want to do something about this terrible disease and understand how different populations experience healthcare in different ways. That's the first step of a 12-step process. You have to admit you have a problem, and data plays a key role in helping to understand that.
Marc?
Well, I wonder if Tim has been sitting in my office, and because when you said crazy therapeutics, we got some noise in our data, 2.5 years ago, that we saw there's really a run at the retail pharmacy with hydroxychloroquine, and the question was, what is this, and do we have some type of helminth infection? What's going on, right? So, to your point, we saw that in our data, and let me just speak a little bit about our data and what our CEO says about our data. He believes it's more valuable than our company in its entirety. So for the last 20, 25 years, we've been ingesting point-of-purchase consumer data. It's really consumer-driven data. And over the years, the past decade, we've actually been merging that point-of-purchase consumer data into a data lake where we actually ingest claims data, both on the pharmacy and the claims side. And so with permission, this is a HIPAA-secure lake. And what we're doing is we're able to surface risk in a population. And we've been socializing that with our payer partners around the country. And the great thing about the story that we tell is that we know, and this is not Big Brother watching, but with our analytics, we know when Mrs. Jones is on this journey of buying a 12-pack of a sugary sweet beverage. And we can see in the chart, I'm not allowed to say that, so when we see in the chart that, hey, we see her first diabetic medicine. And then we're seeing the second. We see the hypertensive medicine. We see the statin. And next we see, a toe amputation, right? So that's a journey. And so we've been able to model that down to the communities that we serve. And I'll share why that's important. When we're able to model that down to the communities that we serve, we get very close to the census block level. And when we get down to the census block level, then we have actionable information that we can then surface to AMCs, to payers, to make them aware of what that prevalence and that risk profile looks like for disease. And then if you've ever can just conceptually think about, again, why a grocer is here talking at Accelerate Health, you think about some of the most diverse populations that you can serve and what's representative of a community. I've been told it's not church on Sunday or Saturday, but if you want a diverse population, go to a grocery store, right? You go to the emergency department in that community, and then finally go to the county jail. That's very representative of what the community looks like, and so we take that as a really significant point of being able to take this data, and at scale, mind you. And I'll just give you one more example and pass it to my colleague. Just in 2021, we were able to collect over 320 million unique types of healthcare visits that happened at Kroger. So you think about scale at 320 million unique visits. That's a prescription or a visit to our clinic or a specialty pharmacy visit that we have. And so that creates a lot of data. And with that data and with the folks that are our data engineers and data scientists, it's giving us really great insight into what we can actually do in the future in terms of delivering solutions that are personalized to the communities that we serve. So personalized, individual, almost talking about, one of the colleagues mentioned like precision medicine. How do we get to the point that we know that this will work for you? So when we start ingesting more of the data around the genomic experience, we believe that we could begin to really understand that. And on my final comment here is that we want to change the way healthcare is delivered. We know it's broken. We know it's fragmented. It disproportionately affects those the most vulnerable. And so if we want to change that, we have to do it with data, but we also have to do it by making this journey personal and making sure that it works for those who it's intended to work for. So we'll turn to you.
I love being last because I get to hear all of these great things and maybe try and add another thought. I have a story that comes out of one of our partners out of VCU Massey, Virginia Commonwealth University Massey Cancer Center, where I think it really embodies this particular leader who heads up the Massey Cancer Center. His name's Dr. Robert Wynn, going out of his way to pull in unusual data and new data to try to look at this problem of cancer, and also out of his way to pull in community stakeholders and involve the people in what is their safety net hospital, the Richmond area, very large urban community with a lot of diversity. I think when you're thinking about how to reach communities that have been underserved or disenfranchised, I'm thinking about my own upbringing, single mom, 3 kids, 3 different fathers. She worked 3 jobs. I only remember going to see a doctor if I broke my arm, got pink eye, got lice, got ringworm, whatever weird thing was going around the school. We went to see somebody. But other than that, I don't remember going to a well visit. And the people that we're trying to serve are not necessarily having the time to do with this extensive research to find out what's available to them. So we have to go out of our way. Now, everyone in this room is already doing that because we're living, breathing this work every day. And I've heard wonderful stories from the earlier meeting going for gold around community engagement. But some of the things that one of our client partners, Dr. Wynn, is doing at VCU Massey is Faith Fridays. He's meeting with pastors every single Friday of different churches and doing podcasts. We're meeting in person during COVID podcasts, now in person with their congregations. Not only does he understand the importance of grocery stores, but I wish we had a Kroger in every community. We don't. How about food deserts and convenience stores? How do we get fresh produce in convenience stores? He's having those conversations. He's asking us to help him create, and working with his staff to create reports for legislators of the catchment area broken down into legislative districts. So when he meets with the legislator and he's trying to help them understand the importance of the health equity in their community, he can show them real data about the constituents that are voting for him or her, that legislator. And getting the vote is what's important, right? So if we're asking for money, we need to make sure we show these lawmakers what's going to be necessary to support their constituents and why that funding is important. He's asking us to look at all sorts of maybe non-standard data around environmental data elements, air quality, water quality, of course the social determinants of health, so critically important, but transportation and distance to health care, some of these kinds of very logistical factors of what's happening in the community is really critical as a barrier, and how do we break down those barriers. Another piece of research that he brought forward indicated that African Americans really prefer menthol in cigarettes, and so if we could just do away with menthol in cigarettes, that could really drastically impact lung cancer. So he's really working hard to try to work on that legislation. So the data from a clinical perspective, so critically important, and everyone here is doing great things, and that's improving, but also would just encourage that we think about these maybe non-traditional or qualitative data elements that could enrich the work as well.
Can I make a comment? She mentioned menthol, and I'm sitting next to somebody who knows an awful lot about menthol.
I have strong feelings on this topic.
You're the moderator. I got to be quiet here. Data works a lot of ways. And Marc, this is not a Kroger story. I'm looking at Susanna because it's a large grocery distributor that has a store up the street from where we live. And I stopped the data works two ways. I stopped the gentleman, the salesperson, the sales guy who was driving the truck that was stocking the soft drinks in that particular store because he didn't have any diet Atlanta beverage company that you may have heard of. They didn't have any diet stuff. And I said to him, I said, I'm here to buy diet stuff, but there isn't any. He says, oh, that's because this is a sugar community. Sugar community. They know the data. They know what sells. And now every time I go to a grocery store and I look at their shelves, I can determine whether or not this is a community that's avoiding sugar or this is a community that's consuming sugar. And those stores are stocked and you know, because of that data. So another example of how data works on the other side of the equation. It's just fascinating. And then being in New York 2 weeks ago, greengrocers on the street, on the street with some really good-looking fruits and vegetables, right? Where you want to say, I want to buy that. And you mentioned food deserts, and thanks for saying such nice things about Rob, because he's a great guy. And he'll, you know, we'll have that conversation because that's a very serious issue. And again, I suspect a lot of people in this room know that.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that, right? Within in our stores, key retailing and the merchandisers use that data that you just described to format stores. You get formatting of stores is a data science. It's a living, breathing testament of how data works at scale, because you see all retailers doing that, and the formats of their stores reflect it. But it also reflects some of the problems that we can uncover with the data by making some changes. We know that those are what gets on the shelves and gets shelf space is what sells. And then so what we have done, and we have really put a lot of pressure on our consumer packaged goods, so that Atlanta-based company, right? We have put some pressure to say, you want some shelf space, you want real estate in our stores. Let's do a couple of things together. So by 2025, we have said that we want a 20% improvement in the 5 most important areas of health, one being obesity. We want 18 less million obese folks in this country. We also want, I just want to make sure I get it right, we also want to have 20 million less diabetic folks. We want to address food insecurity by reducing that by 8 million people. And then we want to do this 2 ways that I think is impactful. We want to pass on the savings to our consumers. So we want to have $58 million in cost savings for our consumers to have healthier products. And we want to do that by adding 15,000 healthier products or SKUs for our stores. So to your point about, hey, this is a sugar store, how do we begin to, on that journey, give us healthier SKUs, at the same time using it in a culturally appropriate way that meets the profiles for that community, so they will purchase them, right? So then you get the healthy effect, right? So can it be incrementally by, with our CPG saying, let's do this together. You get shelf space, give us a healthier SKU, don't raise the price, and let's convert that store to a diet store. I could use that example.
Healthy diet store.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up for questions. I have a question for Eric. So when I was at FDA, I met with a lot of unhappy people, but I particularly met with a group of unhappy people who were very exercised around the topics of clinical trials accrual. And they say, why can't the FDA just not approve the drug if it's not tested in the appropriate population? Why can't it just force those manufacturers, those industry, to test their drugs and products in appropriately diverse populations? And I would say, well, look, we don't have a lot of control over what industry brings us. We can badger them, we can say mean things, but at the end of the day, we got to approve the trial that is before us. And so I would blame you guys. So what is industry's obligation, if any? You know, what could industry do better or differently or to improve their statistics?
I think it is an obligation, and it's not like we're not trying. It's just not so simple, right? I mean, you know, I think it's a system issue, and I mentioned sort of the things that we're doing to try to help. But I do think, you know, FDA now has put some teeth into it with this requirement for diversity plans. You know, I think with the idea being that, if you don't live up to that, there could be problems, during the submission process. And so, again, I mentioned we have to go to sites, right? So we have global sites. We, of course, look for sites that can enroll diverse populations. But again, I think as has been discussed, it's a system issue, right? So major cancer centers are trying to do it. I think they're getting better. We're working with HBCUs to make sure we can do our trials at their sites. But I think it's something that we have to work at together to make it happen. And so I appreciate you not blaming industry solely for the problem.
Yeah.
Well, we built our clinical trials access network for exactly this problem.
Right.
So most of the people that qualify for a clinical trial are not showing up at investigator sites. So long ago, we started addressing this with claims data, which can only take you so far. And more recently, we have reached out to community centers to obtain their permission to actually do pre-screens on the medical records to match up against available trials. So what we're trying to do is to create a matching environment for people where they're visiting healthcare to match it up against available trials. And it's what, 80, 90% of people are in community centers?
So that's really interesting. So do you give that information back to the person, or how?
The sponsor. It's a two-sided network. We need permission from the health system, and then we engage with sponsors who have trials that they.
So the sponsors, you tell the sponsor there's somebody out there that you might be interested in talking to because they could be eligible for your trial.
With permission, right? So it's based off identifiable information.
Why don't we open up for questions? Anybody out there? I know there will be some. We'll go over here again.
Yeah. So the question I have is, I've been on the ground with people and talking to them in the communities. And the information that comes out of this data, some of them don't really care about. Misinformation drives decision-making in underserved communities in ways that you can simply not imagine. The choice to be a part of a clinical trial might be a piece of misinformation that's been floating around in that community that keeps everybody away. Being able to deliver evidence-based information from a trusted messenger in a cultural context that the community understand is essential. We have had the problem of trying to get this across with COVID, and we struggle with it for a long time in these communities until we started going after those trusted messengers. We got pastors to sit on a stage in their own church and get a COVID vaccination for the congregation to see. We went on Facebook Live with translators to try and help people who had English as a second language to understand that this is not going to kill you. There is no probe in here that's going to do this or that to you. And again, we had situations where we had young black men in those underserved communities that got the idea, they got the COVID vaccine, they would have erectile dysfunction. And the idea is that there is nothing that you can say to overturn that level of misinformation.
Anybody want to
Amen.
take on misinformation? Well, I'll ask you guys a question, because this does bring up something that the NCI used to argue about. So there are kind of two schools of thought on this. And you remember, you've only got $1 to spend. You have finite resources. So is the biggest problem the stuff we were talking about earlier with Dana Dornsife about access and parking and structure of the clinical trial? Very expensive to fix, but no doubt those are barriers that preclude certain populations. Or is it the trust issue we just heard about? Is that what's keeping specific populations out? You can't fix both because they're both expensive. So which one should you take on?
Ned.
Yeah, I don't know.
But for real, man, I got to tell you.
Sounds like a false choice.
You spend so much time in government. I have to be careful when I say something like that, because this is one terrific person who did so much for healthcare in this country. So I want to acknowledge that and say thank you on a personal level. That is a really critical problem. That, and I commented on this earlier today, but not the audience didn't hear it, where there are physicians in this country who have spent hours upon hours upon hours trying to provide that resource. But ultimately, the community is so critical. And yes, it is a budget issue because the fact that we don't have the resources that we need. In some communities, all the resources won't make a difference. It won't get through some of the chatter, clatter, whatever you want to call. In other communities, it's a matter of trust. And to build those trusted resources, to create those information pathways, there are health professionals in this country who have spent hours every day. And I will tell you, you'd sit in the room with physicians, and they would just literally hang their heads and say, but it's not just about the docs. It's not just about the clinicians, all the clinicians. It's not about all the things. It took I hate to use the phrase, it took a village. It's a lot more than a village. It took a commitment, and our commitment has not been there to the degree it needs to be in order to meet people where they are. Getting to Jasper real quick and to encapsulate it, we have 17,000 people up until now. We have more today than we did then. We have people calling us from parking lots who are living in cars trying to get cancer care. Wow. Okay? And we've got to try to figure a way out of that. This is the wealthiest country in the world. I come from a state that did not expand Medicaid. We just had a 450-bed hospital close in the middle of our city, and we're trying to figure out who's going to take care of those patients. We have, I don't want to get too detailed, but we have one place that gives people the card from when they see an emergency patient to go to another hospital to get their medical care. We need to start paying attention to the issues. We need communities that are engaged to be supported. And we need to make sure the patients who have cancer get the care they need no matter what their circumstances, and they have the support that they need, and that we understand what their needs are and provide for that care as appropriately as we possibly can.
Want to say something, Marc?
It's interesting. Misinformation, as it goes on its journey, becomes dominant logic in communities. And when dominant logic actually takes over, it doesn't become misinformation anymore. It becomes a cultural and almost a phenomenon culturally. And so that's why it's so important to have representation that can address that. And as you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were knuckleheads out there saying that blacks couldn't get COVID. Guess what? Guess who killed the most? Amen. Right. So that they got that wrong. And so, but it actually created that dominant logic that trials aren't for me. I'm going to be a guinea pig, or I'm not going to do X, Y, Z. And let me just quickly say this one point: as we look to combat misinformation, which becomes dominant logic, understanding that the traditional medical infrastructure that we have has given us the results that we have today, right? That you mentioned. Our poor quality scores, right? We're spending the most of any developed nation. Looking at some of the most accessible healthcare providers, which are pharmacists, and I'm a little biased, they're in our organization. How do we get them in the fray? How do we get them talking to the communities that they serve? They've been embedded in communities, and then there's no appointment to see them, right? You can just walk in. And so we want to leverage that network and create an opportunity of providing education, awareness to populations in a way that can be meaningful, especially around the availability of therapeutics, the availability of trials, the availability of health around our food as medicine concept. So I'll pause there.
I think the ideas you pose are really creative and maybe not even costly, but it takes creativity and really thoughtful coordination, because what you're bringing forward is almost like what we see in the social media world of how you would use an influencer.
Yep.
I was talking to a friend in my neighborhood over the weekend who works for lumber liquidators, and they're paying $15,000 a post on Instagram for home improvement influencers to post something about lumber liquidators flooring. So I don't think it would cost much. You probably just had to ask and invite influential people in the local community to speak out on the topic, and they probably did it. I don't think you'd have to pay them $15,000 a post. But I guess the issue is we need more representation among influential people who are speaking, either policymakers or corporate leaders. So what are we doing in our hiring practices, in our recruiting practices to get more representation so that when we do have companies or political leaders speaking out on the importance of this topic, that people listen, that the people we need to listen pay attention.
Let's take another question up there. Was next, I saw.
Thank you. This is Anil Shankar from Mehri Medical College, Senior Vice President for Research and Innovation. So thanks to all my colleagues and the panel members, this is a systemic problem and there has to be a systemic solution. Of course, there is lack of information. So of course, education, awareness, all that has to be properly executed to remove that lack of information. But there is more than that. And on behalf of HBCUs and Black Medical School, I can give you some perspective. Let me start with an example. We participate in some multicentric trials on lung cancer, where Vanderbilt, Duke are also sites of enrollment. The data shows that at Mehri, we are able to enroll African Americans at a success rate of 85%, whereas Vanderbilt, Duke are nowhere close. Why is that so? The answer is that we have trusted connections with the partnerships and communities. They help. But the problem is we don't have infrastructure. We can enroll more. And thanks to Novartis and Merck and Sanofi, we are trying to address that issue of infrastructure at HBCUs to build those clinical trial centers. But the problem is we don't have clinical coordinators. We don't have research coordinators. We don't have staff. So if we have to address this issue, despite the mandate from NIH for decades and latest from FDA, scenario is not going to change. Majority institutions do not have trust with minorities. They have to take help from HBCUs. And HBCUs need infrastructure. So if we have to solve the problem, we have to look upon how we build that infrastructure. That's the systemic problem. So that is my 2 cents to address this issue.
Anybody want to take on that comment? I
Actually,
fully agree.
For me that,
I fully agree. That's a great comment. Yeah.
Drop the mic.
trust is a big problem, but infrastructure is too.
I have a question
expensive.
back. Was the IGNITE HBCU Act, the infrastructure or institutional grants for new infrastructure, technology, and education, was that enough to scratch the surface?
Mehri participates in IGNITE and does great enrollment. So yes.
But it takes time to get the funding and then put it in place, I take it.
Or I think
Yes.
that's not enough. I mean, that's
That's
beginning,
just
but
not
that's not sufficient.
Yeah.
And let me
Proceed.
add one more.
John
comment.
Pierre has a comment.
Hi. So as I'm listening to this is very, very educational to me. One of the things that I really am learning from this experience is the need from a data analytics perspective to have more African Americans be involved in data analytics. It's just screaming at me how that's important. And the other thing is that in too many situations, as my colleague from Mehri just pointed out, is that HBCUs are always the afterthought. So when there's that, and considering, for example, you have major injustices involving health care in African Americans, such as Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee, and on and on and on and on and on. Until you start addressing those underlying injustices, you're going to have a very difficult time with trust issues. That's just a fact. You can't get away from that.
You're absolutely right, and part of that is, at its core, you're describing a little bit of structural racism and how structural racism creates all of the very next steps, as you describe, right, being an afterthought. Some of that, situates around things like funding mechanisms, right? So there's a lot of things that we have to do better. And then I agree with your point, having more representation on the data analytics side that could show a diverse workforce, and then they could be part of making some changes. I agree.
Sitting here, I'm just reflecting, and I don't know if it's relevant, but I'm going to give it a shot. I was a physician a long, long time ago, and we're talking about in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we had drugs that we were researching, and they weren't oncology drugs at the time. There was one time it was hypertension, antihypertensives. And those drugs were studied in white men and some white women. And there was a lot of hypertension, remains a lot of hypertension in the black community. Yep. So we're talking a long time ago, folks. And I'm sitting here and I listen. I said, have we made any progress? Have we genuinely made any progress? Have we put people into the community? And for the Hispanic community, I was out in L.A. a number of years ago, and community health workers, my Spanish is not good, promotores, are people who are not necessarily trained but who have the trust and go into the community. I came back to my wife, who's on the Technical Adult Education College Board in Georgia. I said, Sandra, we need to have health workers. And in some places have health workers. What's the first thing you run to? Well, what's the educational process going to be? What's the licensing process going to be? How are we going to get them paid for? Well, in that community in L.A., nobody had asked those questions. They just were out there, and they were, and in South Georgia, where my wife was a GYN, there was a woman in that community, in the Hispanic community, Latinx community there, who actually brought the young women in when they were pregnant, knew who they were, brought them in the door so they got prenatal care. It's been a long time. You're right. We're still talking about the same things we've been talking about for decades. What are we going to do different?
It's far from being in the end zone and doing your touchdown dance, but there's certainly progress. I think the awareness of the issue is much higher today. From an analytic perspective, I can tell you the people that we deal with are absolutely focused at making sure the work that they do are based on representative populations. They're looking for disparate outcome in the analytics that they do. And by the way, I am not declaring victory here, right? We are miles and miles and miles away, but it is getting better.
You have some people here in the audience who don't agree with you.
Well, I would agree that you need smart people of all colors working to build analytical models and monitor and manage those models, having that human in the loop to look for bias. However, technology can also be improved to start to identify bias in and of itself. So we're putting a lot of investment into R&D to look at a lot of the bias shows up on the front end before you even put data into an analytical model, because as you know, models can be developed and they'll do exactly what they're told and trained to do or developed to do. But so much needs to happen just on the data management and the data quality and the data cleansing before it even goes into the model to make sure that it's not bad data going in, dirty data going in. So those checks need to happen at the very beginning on the initial data sets, on how they're prepared, on then how they're analyzed. And technology can start to do a better job of actually comparing and testing models against other models on a continuous real-time basis, so that as models start to degrade or perform worse over time, that can be identified and flagged and can be terminated, and another model can take over. So it starts to get a little bit weedy and a little bit techy, but I'll say that the technology is getting better to look for these types of things, but also we need more diversity for the people working behind the technology.
We need to wrap up, but maybe one question here seems motivated.
It's not a question, it's a statement. I've loved the panel and the authentic dialogue you've had. But to answer your question, are we getting better? It depends on the question that you ask. When it comes to socioeconomic disparity between black and white, we are doing worse. Then when we had the civil rights movement, the wealth gap.
You push a button.
The wealth gap, the wealth gap was smaller than it is today. And so in Brooklyn, where we come from, Medgar Evers College, we have the largest amount of public housing, not in the state of New York, but in the world, with food deserts. So, Dr. Lichtenfeld, when you go through New York and you see all the wonderful produce.
It was downtown. It was downtown.
remember us. We can, it's not a resource issue, it's a will issue. How can we work together to will that there's more parity and equity in the underserved communities?
Real quick.
This is a great start. I'm looking around this room. This is the most diverse room I've seen in a long time. The thing about thought leaders, you've got a ton of thought leaders. Don't capture this. You literally have thought leaders, people in this room that can pick up a phone and make a connection. Don't lose this. The data analytics, it's that human touch. Hey, I got a problem. How can you help me? This room, I think, represents that. You did a very good job starting this. Keep it going.
Well said. I'd like to thank our panelists, and we'll move on. You guys off?